morning, Dr. Ian Jin and Dr. Bryan Reber. I will start in Portuguese with a piece of information. Bom dia a todos os participantes. Obrigado por aceitar o nosso convite para conversar sobre o tema crises corporativas. Esse tem sido um dos principais focos de atuação da Imagem Corporativa ao longo dos anos e de forma crescente, porque vivemos num ambiente global de complexidades que se multiplicam, aumentando assim também a responsabilidade das empresas e organizações em geral na gestão do tema de temas sensíveis e crises. E o tema parece mais do que oportuno porque vivemos hoje no Brasil uma crise de saúde, uma crise econômica e uma crise social em decorrência da crise econômica. Hoje esses cenários de risco para as empresas, eles vão muito além daqueles riscos de 10 ou 15 anos atrás, que eram os riscos de recall, riscos trabalhistas. Hoje a multiplicidade de riscos é muito maior, então alcançam variáveis como os temas ambientais, sociais e de governança, o famoso conceito ESG, questões de diversidade, equidade, inclusão, ética na cadeia de valor, enfim. Então hoje o cenário é muito mais complexo e as empresas e organizações são levadas a olhar para esse tema com um olhar muito mais atento. E nós temos hoje muita satisfação de receber os professores doutores Ian Jin e Bryan Reber, do Graduate College of Journalism and Mass Communication da Universidade da Georgia, nos Estados Unidos, onde eu participo como membro do Advisory Council há 4 anos. Eles são também coordenadores do Crisis Communication Think Tank, onde eu também participo. E eles foram responsáveis pela edição do livro Advancing Crisis Communication Effectiveness, lançado recentemente, um livro com 15 capítulos, onde profissionais de comunicação do mercado e membros da academia, professores de diferentes universidades americanas, trabalharam a 4 mãos para construir esses capítulos e proporcionar conhecimentos vindos dessas duas fontes para contribuir para o debate sobre crises corporativas. Só para dizer que quem quiser fazer perguntas, nós vamos ter uma apresentação deles durante cerca de meia hora, 40 minutos, mas há também possibilidade de perguntas pelo chat. Quem quiser endereçar perguntas a eles, nós vamos, nessa segunda fase, fazer isso. Now I switch to English. Thank you again, Dr. Ian, Dr. Bryan, for joining me to discuss crisis communication topics. I have just mentioned to our audience that you have just edited a very interesting book. So to start our conversation, and I try to address some of the topics that are discussed in the book. My first topic is related to a kind of timeline. I would say that probably two of the most remarkable corporate crises ever took place during the 80s. It was the Tylenol case and the Exxon Valdez accident. Those crises took place in a time when social media was not born yet. And so what we see now is that new technologies, new systems of communication and social media are all over and ready to destroy reputations, jeopardize brands, and impact business in a negative way. So the book you edited sheds light over the potential role of technology and social media during a crisis, not only when publicity is given to negative effects, but on the other hand, when digital channels are used to guide and support people and companies during sensitive situations. So my question is, what are the main learnings coming from the digital frontier in the context of crisis?
Well, thank you, Ciro, and I will start, and Dr. Reber will chime in. Yeah, so I will first refer to, there are a few chapters in this book that we talk about the digital transformation of crisis communication, and also how digital technology made crisis become stickier than ever, including Ciro, among the two chapters you co-authored with us. One of your chapters focusing on social media, mobile technology, and also other sorts of internet technology transformation. So I'll be referring to that, the insights, as we continue our discussion. So first of all, very interesting, we refer back to the 20s, right? The classic crisis cases. Back then, the way we disseminate the crisis information is more like one way. So organization, here's what's going on. We tell the story to the press, and then via that step, gatekeeping, our public stakeholders, the general public, get to know about the crisis issue, what's going on, right? So, however, what your comment earlier about the time over the 20, 30, 40 years, so that the speed and the spread, it just kind of dramatically changed. That reminds me of Albert Einstein, the theory, relativity theory, right? So really the time is really relative. It's relative in terms of, it's in the perception of the public. It's also in the, in how technology make our demand, make our anticipated speed of responses so transformed. So in light of that, I think what technology, what social media has changed is, first one is that it opened up so many different voices. So there are so many content creators out there, so many content spreader out there. So for organization in crisis, for the industry in crisis, you feel like you're out of control. So like, for instance, Twitter is a place that you don't have any control. So much information out there. And also from public stakeholders, it's also, how much is too much. So for the public's receivers end, people are receiving kind of lower the erosion of trust. Who should I trust? Who should I turn to? So much information overload, right? So overall, the key challenge, as we see it from our book and insights, is that number one challenge is misinformation challenge. So it's so hard to discern truth from falsity. To make things worse, we're no longer very often talking about black versus white, true or false. There are so many different complex shade of gray in between. Right? Sometimes the piece of information sent out, spread, go viral. It's have maybe 50% of truth. However, the other 50% is falsified. But how do you tell? So for organizations, when we're trying to debunk misinformation, we're trying to correct misinformation, correct misperception. They are just the task gets so much trickier. And then the second challenge is the trust. Right? As we know, globally, our general public and stakeholders' trust of organizations, trust of media, trust of government agencies has been historically low. So that makes communication even harder on social media, even with the technology, because particularly there are many sources traditionally was more trusted, like mainstream media or government agency in times of a public health crisis. However, during COVID, we see the trust level going down for both news agencies and government agencies. So misinformation, trust, and also this fatigue felt by the stakeholders, all jointly creating this stickiness situation in the bigger background of social media crisis communication. So Dr. Reber, any thoughts from you?
Sure, thank you, Dr. Jen. What I think about this, Ciro, when you mentioned the Exxon Valdez in the early 80s, and as Yen is talking about the lack of control by organizations, I mean one of the major changes is that control. When the Valdez started leaking oil in Prince William Sound in Alaska, Exxon was really able to keep reporters away. It was a very distant location, and unless the journalists' medium had the means to fly them there, Exxon was not flying journalists there to see things. Now journalists don't need that kind of permission. or individuals don't need that kind of permission. And I think that is that's one of the main challenges and differences. The other thing I would say is that, and you talked about maybe 50% truth and 50% falsity. I would say it might be 5% truth and 95% falsity. But all you need is a nugget of truth for people to begin to believe. I don't know. I'm sure that there's a similar kind of children's game in Brazil, but in the U.S. there's a game that we play called telephone game, and we whisper in one person's ear, and then the next person whispers, and the message, of course, gets more and more garbled as it goes from person to person. Well, I think the same is true in social media. Even though the message is forwarded, either retweeted or shared, it is still very possible to misinterpret and to sort of underline the misinformation that is going on. So I would say, yeah, that social media is a challenge, but it is increasingly a manageable challenge. We are learning more and more how to sort of take the reins away from disinformation. One of the things that is important to consider is where did the crisis begin? If it began on Twitter, it should be addressed on Twitter. If it began on Instagram, it should be addressed first on Instagram. It should be where the people who are spreading the misinformation or fanning the flames of crisis where they're staying. Those are my thoughts.
Okay, thank you both. You mentioned we are talking about the huge dimension of the challenge. So it seems more than ever, preparedness is essential. So we know that big companies and organizations are used to adopt systems and tools to identify potential risks and anticipate sensitive scenarios. But my question is, how smaller businesses, especially in emerging markets, may address this challenge?
Well, I think when you mention the power of large organizations, it instantly came to mind Delta Airlines. And when you walk into their crisis communication operation, there is a wall of monitors, and there are dozens of people following online conversations. This, of course, isn't possible for those organizations, like you say, Ciro, that are not global powerhouses, and maybe even in developing countries. I think there are things that are possible to do. Nevertheless, as you say, preparation is key. Even if you are a small organization, you can still anticipate at some level the types of what are the worst things that could happen to you, and if that worst thing happened, how would you address it? This, and of course, this can be anything from a formal sort of a plan, or something that is simply thought about by the owner of this small business. Of course, it's also possible, depending on the means of the business, is to outsource that management. And so we outsource it to an agency or to a specialist like Imagem Corporativa. And I think that is another powerful way to get through this. My final thought is that even though, in addition to preparedness, we need to be able to monitor the social channels that are talking about us. And that's, of course, there are very sophisticated ways to do that, but there are also very modest ways that can be beneficial. Something as simple as having a Google Alerts on keywords that would be relevant to your small business, I think would be a potential way to address that for small or developing organizations. Yeah, and I'll turn it to you.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so I'm teaching a crisis communication class in University of Georgia. And actually, I tell my students that even though the class is called crisis communication, actually what we're teaching is crisis management. So the big difference between crisis communication as one stage, when things already happened, you have to respond. We're looking at really from a preventive perspective. So I often use this kind of healthcare analogy, right? So, well, as an individual, if you get really, really ill, you go to urgent care or go to an emergency room, sometimes it's too late. So the best practice of staying well, staying healthy is to really doing a good job in preventive health. Go see your physician every year to check up. So in my perspective, that a good crisis management is actually to do really good preventive healthcare for your organization, for your company, for our clients, right? So if we look at crisis communication, it's really, for crisis management, we have prevention, preparation, response/communication, and then the recovery and learning and revisit our plan, right? So that's why the prevention phrase is so essential. And especially we talk about the sticky crisis, those big, long-lasting, recurring, challenging topics threatening the entire industry, that becomes even more important for not just small business, bigger business, or even cross-sector. We all need to be co-prepared to addressing those upcoming organizational or economical, social, climate changes overall. So, back to kind of small business, how do we do like modest or sophisticated, or what's proper, what can be done? And when I work with my students in our classroom setting, so we work with, say in Athens, Georgia, we have a lot of local businesses, local nonprofit organizations like restaurants and like health clinics, for instance, right? So all these organizations, when we approach them and say, hey, for your business, for your mission to be even more successful, we come to you to offer our service. We're going to create, working with you, to research, assess your vulnerability, do a really 360-degree assessment of what makes you vulnerable, what's the trends, so what kind of things you can do to shield, protect your business, right? So we develop a crisis management plan tailored towards the small business, their need, and then we help them already orchestrate a communication management system. Then we turn that to them, give them advice, how to follow through, how to update on a yearly basis. So the really interesting learning part for my student team is that when we go to pitch a client, initial response from local business always like, oh, wait a second, we have no crisis, we're not in trouble. So our response is, no, we come to you not because you are in trouble, that's too late, right? But we come to you because there's so much value in what you do. You are so loved by your customer community. We want to protect you. We want to be helpful, right? So then, I then have this aha moment. But why there's such beneficial to be preventive oriented. So just kind of using some Athens, Georgia, and our class example, how do we persuade, how do we bring clients on board to show the value of crisis prevention in overall business healthness, business well-being in the community?
I'd like to add just a couple of things. That the health analogy made me think that just because an organization or an entity is large with lots of resources doesn't mean that their crisis communication is going to be good. Let's take the U.S. response to the COVID crisis right now. There are all the resources at our that we could want, and nevertheless, the health messaging has been both good and bad. Small businesses may be better because they are more nimble and they are more able to change quickly. That's it.
Okay, thank you for your views. It's clear enough that the bar is always raising. So there are more and more variables for companies to pay attention at in order to prevent risky situations and crises. And it's interesting that unlikely 10 or 12 years ago, it's not enough anymore when a given organization is involved in a crisis. It's not enough just to fix the problem. Now, the public opinion, the stakeholders, want organizations to restore trust, rebuild empathy, and not only apologize, but also show a real commitment in terms of improving best practices to avoid the problem to happen again. So the bar is going up and up and up. And so how important in this context, my question is, how important is at this point for organizations to grant a kind of, let's say, human or emotional touch when publicly responding to a crisis?
Yeah, I'll respond first. The short answer is it's essential and critical to be human, to have communication that's really kind of with high authenticity. And so genuine, timely, sincere, and not just to, if a crisis is truly caused or your organization is responsible for the situation, when you deliver an apology, that should be sincere, that should be showing compassion to your audience, but also just to say you apologize is not enough. Right. So from our crisis communication scholarship and research and documented best and worst practices, what we learned over those years is that apology only works when it is paired with corrective action. So which means you are sorry, then show me what you are going to do, not just right after, immediately, short term, but also long term. Because as we know, let's use in the BP crisis, the oil spill crisis years ago, right? So of course, there's a really bad apology being made. Later on, their CEO was gone. They have to really rebuild the entire image of BP as a company, not just over years. I think they are still not quite over that initial big impact on their brand image and on their community and on their global operation, right? So authenticity is the key in communication, in apologizing, in issuing corrective action, short-term and long-term. And back to emotion, actually there is a rich literature in social psychology has documented why emotion is so important, why understanding public's emotions in crisis is so important. As we know, in times of stress, in times of crisis, there are a mixture of all kinds of negative emotions. So we identify via our research, there are sadness, there are anxiety, there are anger, and then there are fear. So for an authentic communicator, for a good listener, right, the first thing you do is not really think about what should we say to protect our image. The first reaction should be, how can we help? How can we think in the shoes of our publics? How do they feel? So the way you address a very angry audience versus a very predominantly sad audience. So the approach underneath the same authenticity umbrella can be very strategically tailored towards their need. And here's the reason why, backed up by psychology theory, we call that coping, we call that emotional coping, right? So for our audiences, individuals, we cope with a crisis, we cope with negativity via different routes. So what we need from organization in times of crisis are very often two types of information, two types of responses. One is, we call that informational support, which means to address the cognition part of our needs. So imagine a natural disaster happened, an earthquake or a terrorist attack. The initial feeling will be, what's going on? We want to make sense in times of fear, in times of uncertainty. So that is up to the organization or authority to immediately tell the audience, so what's going on at this moment, to our best knowledge, what's happening? We're going to keep you posted. So by giving information timely, accurately, even to be very transparent about, this is really, we don't know enough, but this is what we know. I'm telling you this, but we will follow up. That helps a lot to relieve the negative sense, feeling of uncertainty. A lot of fear and anger can be kind of managed properly that way. And then the second very important emotional responses will be to provide action support. So now we make sense of what's going on. Tell me what to do. How can I manage? How can I protect myself and our family, right? So both the cognitive and behavioral coping needs to be timely, authentically facilitated by organization. And that needs to be incorporated in organizational messages, in the apology if needed, and also in the actions with compassion. So those are some quick thoughts based on our research and practice in the past.
And I would like to just say that Dr. Jen knows of what she speaks here. One of her key areas of research is in emotion and the importance of emotion in both crisis and conflict management. One of my areas of research is the interaction of lawyers and public relations practitioners during times of crisis. And the importance of that, I think, to this question is that for public relations practitioners, we need to be the ones who make sure that the organization is empathetic, make sure that the emotion is there, because the knee-jerk reaction of the organization will be to want to say nothing or as little as possible. That certainly is what the lawyers want. They don't want anything out there that could be used in future litigation. But it's our job to manage the courtroom of public opinion, as they call it, and to be sure that empathy, that apology and response are there. And even if it isn't a direct apology, the feeling of empathy, the feeling of I understand, I'm sorry, this is the way it is. We're going to try to be sure it's not this way again. I think those are the keys to managing the human, the emotional part of this.
Yeah, just a quick kind of note to add. Most recently, Dr. Reber and I, we just finished launching a national survey in the U.S. to look at how practitioners, how they see their own crisis leadership and how they managing several industry-wide challenges. Well, again, we found that among crisis leadership attributes, empathy is a key dimension that really distinguish a leader, an effective ethical leader versus not so much mediocre ones. Just want to mention, it's so important in messaging, in internal communication, but also as a leader, that's really essential. That's the hallmark of an effective crisis leader.
This will be published in PR News in coming issues.
Great. Another topic related, I mentioned before, ESG. ESG, those three letters are embedded in all corporate responsible activities nowadays. So I would like to hear from you, your perceptions on how ESG is being put in the loop of the crisis scenario.
I think ESG is, in terms of crisis, it falls into that preparation category. It also falls into the stakeholder trust and loyalty category. I think that good ESG programs, and of course it depends on what the industry is, what the program is, but good ESG programs are preparation and build protection around the organization against crises. There's ample evidence, lots of research that shows that organizations that have strong loyalty, high levels of trust among stakeholders, consumers, employees, that those organizations weather crises much better than organizations that don't have that same kind of loyalty and trust. And particularly right now, and I suppose most of the people on this Zoom know this, but the new generation of employees, those people who are in their 20s and early 30s, are particularly demanding of ESG. They're demanding of it as consumers. They're demanding of it as employees. They want to work someplace that they feel like is doing good, doing the right thing, taking care of the environment, taking care of society. That's why we find ourselves right now in crises around racial tensions. It's why we find ourselves in crises around climate change. So anything that an organization can do that is relevant to its business and industry is really, I think, crisis preparedness. That's money well invested in crisis management. I don't know whether that gets to your question, Ciro, or not, but I'll turn it over to Yen now.
Well, thank you, Bryan. Yeah, so just to kind of add a little bit, so I'll tie back to the kind of social media the topic earlier, right? So if we look at, well, one of the key issues surrounding with ESG, as Dr. Reber mentioned earlier, is we have to kind of managing expectation, right? Not just expectation now, currently, but really to help our clients, organization to think ahead of time. So in 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, 50 years, right? So what's the projected anticipation or expectation of our current and future generations of customers and consumers and stakeholders, global, not just regionally, but globally, right? So that social listening currently, but social listening with projection, with prediction, based on social sciences will become really essential. So back to this kind of social media issues we talked about earlier. If we really look at, well, one of the things we found when talking with our practitioners is that very often we tend to kind of bundle real social media crisis together with, we call that para crisis, which means there are negativity. People complain about our company, but it's actually about customer service. So it's not really a crisis. But then there are more serious crises triggered by misinformation or triggered by other type of challenges. So as one of our think tank member, Timothy Coombs, often emphasize is that, among these true social media crises, the most dangerous one, most sticky pro ones are challenge type of crisis. So what's the essential? What's the challenge? Challenge can be in the form of, think about social movement that went viral, like Me Too movement on social media, right? Think about all the other social movements. So what makes them powerful is that they are challenging not just a product. They're not challenging what's going on, one isolated issue. They are challenging the entire industry because what one company, what a sector is doing is no longer meeting expectation. So they are calling for changes of practice to meet expectation. So ESG is one of the most critical expectations that needs to be fully understood and needs to be fully managed. And also for organizations, from crisis prevention, crisis preparation perspective, we have to manage for tomorrow. So hopefully the best practice is to prevent crisis from happening. So I just want to add to tie back to the social media part of it.
Okay, thank you both. There's a comment in the chat coming from Elisa Diniz, who is responsible for the communication at the World Bank here in Brazil. She says, the most difficult part is when you need to match the different aspects, the public opinion and the legal approach. So, which leads to another topic that I think that is very important. That is how to put people within the same organization on the same page. Very often we see people from different departments or areas in the same organization with completely different views on crisis. And it seems to be, I would like to hear from you, it seems to be almost a psychological challenge I remember that Bill Gates, for 20 years, he said that we had a global risk of a pandemic, because he used to say that we needed to learn from the Ebola effect in Africa. So, and many people, lots of people say, well, Bill Gates is crazy. He's exaggerating. So now we know what happened. The same thing with some fears of a financial bubble in the US, in the financial market in 2007, 2008. So a few people said, well, there's a bubble. Lots of people said, no, this is foolish. So how to create an environment where we can put more and more people from different mindsets and areas within organizations on the same page, and trying to make those people think in a similar way when it comes to crisis, when it comes to preparedness, when it comes to prevention.
Yeah, and you're teaching crisis communication. Do you want to take the first shot at that, or you want me to?
Yeah, sure. I can do that. Actually, I would like to refer back to, since Ciro mentioned about the 2007, 2008 financial crisis. I want to kind of refer to that as an example, because Bryan and I, we did a paper, co-author with some of our alumni and also a public relations practitioner. So we actually got a grant from the Page Center for Integrity in Public Communications to conducting interviews with CCOs and chief PR counsels who actually managed the 2008 financial crisis. So we talked to them, asking them, looking back, what did you learn, right? So the paper has been published in PR Review, and we also presented our findings in different corporations, including 2 years ago now, right, Bryan? It feels like forever. Physically, we presented a headquarters of Aflac in Columbus, Georgia, in our kind of neighborhood. So to work with, to do a little kind of workshop presentation with Aflac, their employee, their communications team, to share what we learned, to share with what we learned from CCOs and practitioners going through managing complex financial crises. So one of the key things we learned, this is also, I stress a lot in teaching crisis communication in the classroom, is that they're tied back to authenticity, right? Tied back to crisis leadership. So just as we communicate with our external audiences with authenticity, with compassion, with this kind of style, with this action of care, we also need to deliver that, thread all of our messages internally to our coalitions, different departments, lawyers, CFOs, employees, our communication staff team. So we call that in times of financial crisis or even health crisis, we need to practice the ethics of care. If you look at ethics literature, there are ethics of justice. But I'm sure most of the lawyers kind of ask, ethics of justice, right? But meanwhile, from communication, the human aspect, Ciro, as you mentioned earlier, is the ethics of care. So justice and care, these two needs to go hand in hand. So when in times of stress, right, when we communicate internally, we're trying to bring people on board, we're trying to bring lawyers, hey, why justice is important? Meanwhile, how can we talk about caring about our employees and caring and express that caring in our communication to investors, to stakeholders, because as we know, sometimes investors' top interests might not be the same with other stakeholders, right? So especially in terms of conflict, when our stakeholders have conflicting interests or priority externally and internally, what can bring us on board together? So based on our finding, actually the practice, the philosophy, the emphasis of ethics of care is one of the very, very essential ingredients that we found. Dr. Reber, over to you.
I think that what I would add is I do think that this is, part of that preparation process. And if you don't have, now I'm thinking of a sort of a global entity, a global corporation. If you don't have your top communicator in the organization with a direct line to the CEO, the COO, that's a problem because you can be guaranteed that in times of crisis, the general counsel, the chief legal person, and the chief communication officer, the CCO, are going to be in the room with the CEO, and the CEO is going to say, what do I do now? And if you don't have that relationship built in terms of preparation, that's part of it. I think the other part of it is being able to convince management that there is a need for a crisis communication team or a crisis management team. That's kind of the way that you can then become a communication evangelist throughout the organization. If you have engineers as well as legal, as well as communicators on this crisis management team, then there's the opportunity for during annual or semi-annual exercises to come together and help them understand the importance of communication and the right communication.
Okay, there's another question here from Poliana Diniz. She asks, how can we better deal with fake news on a larger scale? And she mentions the denial of the benefit of vaccination in Brazil, including a denial coming from the federal government. So how to deal with that?
That's tough. I think I'll take the first stab at this, but I think that specifically with the pandemic and the misinformation and disinformation around vaccines, I think the only thing that communicators can do is to battle that with truth and with evidence. And so I think that from our perspective, we can sort of use the workforce as a way, internal communication, as a way to try to battle that misinformation or disinformation that is coming from outside entities. It's particularly disappointing when it's, that's an understatement, disappointing when it's coming from the government. I think both Brazil and the US have experienced that from time to time. And, but I think the only thing to do is use the channels you have. So use internal communication with employees and get out the truth. I think over time, people will see that vaccines are they're not hurting people, they're beneficial, and that will persuade. But right now, I think it is working through existing channels and getting the truth out.
Yeah, and to add on that, so I think we also need to be very strategic in choosing our battlefield, right? So think about let's use vaccine fake news for instance. For anti-vaxxers, they are not just spreading fake news; they are falsifying information just intentionally to deceive, right? To prevent people taking vaccine. For those people who already have a firm belief against the truth, so don't waste your energy or source. You know, they don't believe. If they don't believe in truth, there's no point. They'll never change their mind. Right. So, but the good news is that the mass majority of our audiences, they are kind of like a political campaign, right? It's the middle ground. It's the people with some kind of ambiguity towards the issue, towards the topic, towards vaccine. That's where strategic communication of truth, make truth teller so much more trustworthy than the sometimes deceivingly convincing fake news. But that's where I think strategic communication, that's where communicators, that's where employees can really shine. And then, so we can really debunking fake news, debunking falsehood of vaccine information. We can activate organization, work with trustworthy health agencies, work with organization, employers, and actually we can also activate our internal and external stakeholders. Employee can be a really powerful source to tell the story. And also, even on social media, we see a lot of, nowadays we call this kind of vaccine selfie becomes a trend now. So on social media, Facebook, a lot of our friends probably showing the selfie with their vaccine or even the card or showing their happy face It's like, yeah, now I feel freedom, now I feel confidence, life back to normal. So all these grassroots campaign, those kind of semi-social movement of telling truth about a topic that's being contested by fake news can become really a powerful tool. So let's build our coalition of truth telling. I think that will give us hope, give a better chance to fight fake news in the longer run.
I would just add that one of the chapters that Ciro is co-author on talks about the IDEA model, IDEA, and that's a way to think about communication, particularly related to risks, which of course vaccine is. And I'm going to read from the book here. The I in IDEA is internalization. That means making sure that people believe it's important. The D is distribution. How do you get the message out? The E is explanation. Why is it important? And the A, finally, of course, is action. And so with those four steps, trying to move people to do what we know is the right thing and to be vaccinated and to encourage others. I think the other thing is that we've seen some success in messaging that around, if you're not going to do it for yourself, do it for your grandchildren, do it for your grandparents, do it for someone else. So again, we get to that emotive, person-to-person kind of empathetic messaging.
Thank you both. And you have just mentioned the IDEA process, and this is a good example on how to standardize behaviors, views, approaches. And another question coming from the audience is related to that, how to get a common ground, especially when we have more and more global crises, the climate change crisis, the COVID crisis, and how to deal with that, how to build a common ground, considering that we have involved in those global crises, different cultures, different political views, different backgrounds. So how to deal with that? How to build a common ground?
Yeah, so I will chime in, throw in my 2 cents here. So go back to the chapter, Ciro, that you wrote with the cell nodes. So I think I remember the chapter title, we're actually talking about the competing narratives, right? So I think the key is how can we build common ground and manage a lot of layers of competing narratives from different parts of the world or from internally different layers of our coalition, right? So I think the key challenge is, well, to see, kind of have a deep dive understanding what is the ideal common ground we want to be, where the ground is, what can be said as a ground. And secondly is to look at the source. What are the competition or conflicts, right? So once we know what is dividing us, and then what kind of things we all care about, can tie back to the authenticity, tie back to the ethics of care. That's where we can see a little breakthrough. That's where we can start building via negotiation, via open conversation, dialogue to find that common ground. So I will say that maybe before engaging into this kind of negotiation or communication, right? At the very beginning, the process will be tough because we all want something that we believe is most important to us. Then we have to be willing to compromise. This reminds me of another chapter of our book, Dr. Reber, about contingency theory, right? So there's the right way to build, to find, this is the only good common ground. So we need to be willing to be contingent, willing to work together to find out, okay, so where is the place that we all feel pretty comfortable. I feel like our principles are met, but okay to give out certain things we believe isolatedly is most important to us. So, so Bryan, would you like to add something from that conflict management perspective?
Well, I think the main thing is the notion of being contingent. Even though we have models like IDEA and others that provide some sort of signpost for us in terms of crisis management, crisis communication, we all know that there is no single right answer most of the time in these incidents. It's a matter of having a toolbox that has enough tools in it that we can grab the one that is most appropriate for the given group of stakeholders at the point in time. So arming ourselves with knowledge about best practices and cases, I think is the point there.
Okay, there's a specific topic I wanted to hear from you. You live in Georgia, and what we have seen is a recent, let's say, small crisis in Georgia for some companies based in Georgia, which shows how easy or how frequent it is for brand being exposure in topics that are not related to their core business. The point is the new voting legislation that has just passed in Georgia, which has generated criticism among part of the public opinion in Georgia. And in this context, companies based in Georgia, such as Coca-Cola and Delta Airlines, have been criticized because their supposed positioning on that matter. Long story short, those companies are being criticized. There are some consumers, some traditional clients of those companies saying that they probably they would boycott those companies because of their positioning or alleged position on the new voting legislation in Georgia. I would like to hear from you. You live in Georgia, so I think you have interesting points about that.
Well, we are sorry to be on the news every day for some new strange things that's happening in Georgia, but indeed, voting rights is become a big issue here. And the major players who have come out, of course, are Delta Airlines, Coca-Cola, both based in Atlanta, both large multinational companies. And I think this gets back to the ESG conversation. And that is, we live in a time now that there is the expectation that the brands take a stand, and it's the challenge is, how do you take a stand and walk a very fine line? Now, there are some organizations, like years ago already now, when gun violence was, well, it's always in the news in the US, but when there was a push for, I think it was after Sandy Hook Elementary, there was a push, and Dick's Sporting Goods, a large sporting goods chain, decided to stop selling guns. Well, that's, that was a big part of their business. If you look at it simply from a business perspective, it doesn't make sense. Well, I think that you can say the same thing about Delta and Coca-Cola making comments that are against what the legislature has just done, and it may not appear to be in their best interest. It may appear to be in their best interest to be quiet. But I think actually, if you look at the majority of U.S. citizens who are buying their products, the majority agree that the laws by the Georgia legislature and others around the country are trying to limit the right to vote. And so I think that if you look at the big picture, it's like when Nike embraced Colin Kaepernick. That looked at the face like it was a bad decision, a bad business decision, but no, Nike knew its audience, and they knew that if they embraced this, it would be good for it's the same thing I think that we're seeing now in Georgia with Major League Baseball pulling its all-star game out of Atlanta and out of Georgia. who are most of the players? Most of the players are people of color. Who are the people who work at sports venues? Many are people of color. So who are the stakeholders that stand to benefit or be hurt from this law? Well, people of color. So I think that's a long answer to your question, Ciro. It's a complex problem, and I think it is the challenge is, where in this world of ESG do we take a social stand that's going to be good for the majority of our customers, knowing that nothing's going to make everybody happy.
Yeah, well said, Bryan. And also to add to what you said also earlier, the stage that Ciro said right at the beginning of the session is that being human, right? The same thing happened to big corporations, to small business, right? So any entity, organization, in the eyes of the public, in the eyes of the media, in the eyes of your stakeholders, we're being viewed as a human, right? So humans are different, and being different is a beautiful thing in this world. So I'm thinking about, especially thinking about the big the multinational companies, right? In the free market. So Delta, by assessing what is Delta's purpose as a business, based on their assessment of their expectation, their future customers, they make a decision that's aligned with who they think they are, what they should be. Then they make a stance and go with it. Meanwhile, their competitors, right? They might or might not have the same vision or same target market who have the same expectation. So I think the lesson is that any business, any communication decision, such as making a stand, right? All these has to be tied back to who you are. What's your purpose? We have a whole series over the year interviewing industry leaders in our department called that Driven by Purpose. So I think at the end of the day, so whether you should take a stance or not, what should be saying? The key is not to be reactive because everybody's doing it. Let's jump on the wagon. It's the wrong thing to do. The key is step back, do a deep reflection inwardly, right? So who are you? What's your purpose? What's your value? So if this, by taking the stance, it's in good alignment with your purpose, with your goal, with your business success, with the caring of your employees and your customers, then do it with empathy. I would add with courage, because as Bryan said, nowadays, network can make everybody happy, right? So you know that when you say something, you do something, make big decision, you are going to make somebody else breaking relationship with you. Are you willing to take the risk? Are you willing to really kind of take the consequences for what you think is best for your business, for your organization, for who you care, right? So I think that is really important. So being human, demonstrating empathy, demonstrating and also courage. You have the courage to make decision tying into with your business, with your purpose, and then once you make the decision, be consistent. By doing that, you earn respect as a human being. You earn respect and long-term support from your chosen direction, your chosen customers, who you choose to demonstrate your acts of care.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Yan, Dr. Bryan. It's 12 o'clock in Brazil, 11 a.m. in Georgia. And I appreciate this conversation, and I'm sure that the people who join us also like it and learn a lot about your comments. And I want to thank you both for joining me for this conversation on prices. It's a very interesting topic, and we could talk for one more hour, and but I'm sure that we will have other opportunities in the near future to go on and go deeper in this conversation. So thank you both.
Thank you for the opportunity, Ciro.
Thank you very much.
Okay, and thank you for the audience here, and see you next time.